Okay, greetings everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's session of Quest SJ. It is a session that you're going to find extremely practical, and we have Dr. Natasha Hanson, who's going to be joining from Horizon Health Network. She's involved with the SOAR program. She's really going to be running through how we can practically apply some of the widely used data management systems. So for today, Dr. Hanson will be speaking. You can feel free to put messages in the chat. And when she's done in approximately 20-25 minutes from now, we can go through those questions and then it can go live for people to feel free to ask questions away. We have a variety of people on the line. As always, we represent academia, the community, new learners, and people who've been doing qualitative research for a while. So please, if you're new to our group, feel free to send the quick name on the chat box, your login, because we are still taking attendance. And without further ado, I will pass things over to Dr. Natasha Hanson. So thanks again for joining.
Thanks so much. So hopefully everybody can hear me. Maybe, yes, a nod, good. And I'll share my screen. I have a few slides as well. So let's see if, yeah, so hopefully that's showing up for you guys. Right, so as Monique said, I'm Natasha Hanson and I'm a qualitative methodologist with Horizon Health in the Research Services Department. So I'm just giving a sort of overview, really, in terms of pros and cons of different kind of qualitative data management systems. And then hopefully we can have a discussion about what has worked for some people after we go through your questions. So, there we go. So just going to start off with the title. So we chose Qualitative Data Management Systems as the title because realistically, these help sort of manage your data, but they do not do the analysis for you, which is disappointing to some. It certainly was disappointing to me when I started off using them. Now, I will say that, and we'll discuss this as we go through, there are some programs now that have what's called auto coding. And we can sort of get into that, but realistically, that is not the same as doing an analysis. So I've sort of split it up. So we'll start with sort of common software that can be used. So the intention of these softwares wasn't necessarily qualitative data management or analysis, but they can certainly be used for that. Word and Excel, and these options are really convenient and they're relatively inexpensive as well. So they're good ones in terms of that. And then we'll get into specialized software. And so the three that I've really looked at are MAXQDA, Atlas.ti, and Nvivo, mostly because those are the prevalent ones that I know a lot of researchers use. That being said, there are a lot out there, so this doesn't cover everything. Those specialized softwares have a lot more features and they are a lot more expensive. And I will mention as well freeware. So through internet searches, you can definitely find qualitative data management systems that are free. And full disclosure, I used a freeware version for my PhD research, which was quite some time ago, and that one does not exist anymore, as far as I can tell. And so obviously, a pro of those is that they are free and they do give you better functionality than, say, Word or Excel. However, they are not necessarily supported well. So They could have bugs in it. It could be malware, especially, you know, you wouldn't want to use necessarily an online version either, because what's the safety of your data? And we'll get into that as well, but those are considerations in these specialized software versions as well, in terms of what kind of permissions do you have through REB? Have you explained that your data might be living in a cloud, and are they okay with that? At Horizon Health, they are definitely not okay with that. And so those are things that need to be taken into consideration. And so if you are using freeware, then that's something to think about. So in terms of one of the most common softwares that, you know, is pretty ubiquitous is Microsoft Word. So it's convenient. People have access to that software. If you're doing team-based research, that can be really helpful because then everybody has access to it. Commonly now I will, my disclosure too is that, well, is that I'm talking about doing analysis, but I'm not actually going to get into sort of what theories you're using or what type of analysis or coding, you know, that you're doing. It's really much more sort of how do these different software function to help you go through your data, which is generally interview transcripts, I would think, for the most part. So I'm not getting into sort of the specifics of how you actually are going to go through and code things. But that being said, you know, this is giving you sort of an overview of how they could be used once you sort of get to that point of, you know, what your analysis plan looks like in terms of sort of your theoretical background and how you're going to go about it. And I do think in using Microsoft Word and Excel, one of the downfalls is that you're only using them. So it's a very particular kind of data that you're going to be looking at. So interview transcripts are good for Word, and they can also be used in Excel. Anything with text that you could sort of grab out, you could use, but you can't upload video, audio, any of those things. So generally speaking, with Word, you're using comments essentially to code for themes and or if you're not doing thematic analysis, whatever your analysis is, that's where you're indicating it. And so in that way, it's pretty basic, right? You're sort of grouping things within what you put within those comments. So now I will say that there's quite a few papers online and YouTube videos as well in terms of how you can go about different kinds of analysis using Word. I've put a couple of links there for some YouTube videos. So one of them is looking at qualitative coding and thematic analysis. And it's pretty simplistic, but it works, right? So it'll give you a listing essentially of what in your interview document matches what particular code. And you can print the comments or codes separately and therefore have a list of them. You could do a search for them. And so they can be extracted, these sort of comments / codes, into a new Word document, which would include the coded text, page, and line number, where they could be found in the transcript. But that does entail downloading a macro file and running it. And so there are a couple of videos that do that. I've included one here. So again, you're downloading from the internet an unknown file. That's definitely not something my workplace is open to, but is something others could definitely try. And so I've just given an example. This is from fake data from Nvivo. So essentially, what you could see there is, and this is the other thing, if you're doing team coding, so your name will show up and what you've coded. So you could actually have a team member then code on top of that or go back through, and it will show up separately, which is an advantage. Absolutely. And so it's pretty simplistic, but certainly does the job. Now, often Excel is used in tandem with Word, or at least that I've seen that. And again, so this can work with macros being downloaded so that you can export your Word comments to Excel, and there's a video there. So essentially what you would do is you're still going through your transcribed interview transcripts. You're coding them according to your analysis plan. And then you essentially are allowing a macro to run that will export that to Excel. And that is quite slick. So I would recommend checking that one out if that's of interest. Again, you're trusting sort of downloaded code from the internet, which is a disadvantage. But it is used quite a bit. And then there are some academic articles actually about using Excel for qualitative data analysis. And in these, well, in several of them, they are just recommending that what you do is you cut and paste your transcript into Excel and then essentially coding it there. And this picture is very small, I apologize. But essentially what you see there is, so they've done their transcription in a specific way where they have the question on one line and then right below it, the answer to it. And in that way, you have a nice sort of clean look to your data once it's sort of put into Excel. In this one, what they've done is they've used numerical coding, which there's pros and cons to that in terms of what they then have is a page in that Excel file that has what that numerical code means in terms like in language. So there's a little bit of back and forth, but then again, there's a little bit of back and forth in sort of all of these strategies. So that could be appealing. One thing I will say about this one that I found as a possible disadvantage is that these answers are quite short. You could have quite lengthy answers and you could have a lot more back and forth. That seems like a very clean interview to me. Most people are not that concise. And as an interviewer myself, I'm not necessarily that concise. So if your transcript is more messy looking, then this might be a little bit more difficult. Also, the advantage of Word using comments is that they could overlap one another because depending on your coding style, my coding style is often that I might have several at once, and that might sort of be whittled away or condensed together at a later point. But I definitely want to be able to code more than one thing. I also want to be able to code sections of people's sentences, which this approach wouldn't necessarily allow for very clearly because you're coding one whole response as something which seems pretty limiting to me. Now, you could put more than one, but what text is that attached to? Again, with Word, in comments, at least, you're attaching it to potentially a group of text, that code. And I think that is certainly an advantage because I think most, and again, it depends sort of what type of material you're coding. And so this is why I think often choosing the right kind of software really depends on what it is that you need for your project, what kind of data that you have in your project. If you had really long, in-depth interviews, I don't know that this Excel approach would necessarily work that well. I do think if we go back, the using of the Word comments where then that's exported to Excel would work. And again, if we just look at that, so using those sort of comments where they could be overlapping, you could have more than one. There's quite a bit of functionality there for sort of complex sentences or complex sort of conversations, I guess. So again, I think it really depends on sort of what information it is that you're gathering and what that's going to look like. Now, if we sort of move ahead to specialized software, so the three that I chose are ones that I know quite a few people use. I will say that there are a lot of other ones out there, as I mentioned in the beginning, that I didn't realize were on the market. And so I'm not saying these ones are any better necessarily. They just seem to be more prevalent, particularly within health research. So all of these are Mac and Windows compatible. Now, in looking through them more finely, I did see that Atlas.ti is actually compatible with phones, which I'm not going to do analysis on a phone, but if somebody were wanting to, then they might want to look into that. And so in these ones, the biggest downside is that they're expensive. And so costing really depends on whether you're a student, what organization you work for. All of them seem to have pricing that's dependent on, you know, if you do work for an NGO, say, or a governmental agency, you might get a little bit of a deal. Or a university, they have specific pricing sometimes for that. None of them are cheap. All of them, I believe, have perpetual licenses that you can buy, which means that when you buy it, you get to keep it forever. You download it, it's on your computer. It may then become less and less supported as they put new versions out, but it's yours to keep. These perpetual licenses start around $1,000 Canadian-ish, again, depending on sort of where you fit in that pricing structure. Students, the pricing is usually quite different. And students also, it's not necessarily perpetual. I know with Nvivo, I'm pretty sure it's a year license that you're buying. So it's significantly cheaper, but you don't have access to it after a year. So one thing you could do is check with your organization to see whether they have access to licenses. This seems less and less common as time goes on, but it really depends. I would definitely consider putting the cost in grant applications. Because it's so expensive, it's worth it to write these things in. And MAXQDA and Atlas.ti actually offer flexible leasing, which I didn't realize was a thing until I started to look into these. And that could be great for a short-term project. The one thing to remember is that you're saving all your data into their kind of data file. And so essentially, once you don't have access to that software, you can't open that file. So you would have to make sure that you sort of get out of it all the reports that you want before you lose, you know, before your license was up, kind of thing. But it's certainly interesting and it's much cheaper, their leasing options. And then, because most things have sort of moved towards the cloud, as it were, something to be aware of is that Atlas.ti and Nvivo both have sort of cloud versions, or elements or functions that are cloud-based. And depending on your organization and your project and your RAB approval, that might not be allowable. Again, within Horizon Health, that's not considered safe, because their cloud data, for many of these organizations, is not in Canada. I don't think it's in Canada for any of them, unless I'm mistaken. And also, how secure is that? There are questions around that as well. So things to think about. Now, but saying that, depending on sort of your project and your approval and all of those things, some of the functionality for team coding, if it's cloud-based, is higher. So essentially you can be working on the same file if it's cloud-based for some of these, which would be great. Now, other ones, so even if you've downloaded them, how they merge is also critical. So if you are working in a team, you would want to look at that functionality. Most of them allow you to essentially take several files and put them together. So what it'll do is take all of your different coding and apply it within the same file, and delineate who coded what, which is critical. Now, all of these softwares are capable of auto coding to different degrees and in relation to sort of different elements, I would say. Some of them auto code for sentiment. Others try to say that it's sort of theme-based. I haven't explored these to a great deal, so I don't want to be overly critical, but I will say that, again, it's not actual analysis. And I suspect what's happening there is really it's sort of it's a better version of a textual search, which all of them do also as well. And so maybe that's useful, especially if you had a really big data set. But again, you would still have to go back through and ensure that that coding is correct yourself. And also, I would suspect add to it significantly, because it's really doing a lot of keyword kind of auto coding. And so another piece that some people might be interested in is that all of these will allow you to upload audio files, as well as a whole number of different kind of file types. Many of them also allow you to upload different kinds of citation software, sort of outputs that and therefore essentially you can link your literature within these softwares to your research, which is really great. They will allow you to upload audio, video, and again, there's slight differences. I didn't put them on here because it seems to be sort of a bit of a moving target. Most of them seemed to have a lot of the same stuff. It seems like essentially they've all tried to be quite close in that kind of space, and therefore most file types that you can think of, you can upload. Now, in terms of transcription functionality, MAXQDA and Nvivo currently have that built in to differing degrees. And essentially in those two programs, now I haven't actually used MAXQDA, so I don't know what that visually looks like, but essentially it gives you space in which to upload the audio and then have hotkeys and or a foot plugin so that you can do the transcription in that particular software. It didn't appear that Atlas.ti had that functionality. So that is quite convenient. Nvivo actually also has cloud-based transcription. So from the software, you could send it for a fee to get transcribed. Now, again, it's sending your audio data into the cloud. So you would need to, have REB approval that that would be okay as well. But it's certainly interesting. And for some people, that would be really convenient, particularly if one's REB was open to that and you had the money for it again. So I just put together some sort of questions that you might want to ask yourself about what kind of functionality you want in your software, or what kind of, what do you want in your software essentially, especially if you're going to pay that much for it. I think critically, do you find their coding function user-friendly? So I'll show a snap from Nvivo, and also Carrie Luck is, Carrie is giving a talk that'll sort of have more in-depth detail about coding in Nvivo. So I'm not sort of getting into that here, but, and they do generally sort of look the same a little bit, these programs, but their coding is slightly different, and therefore being able to choose sections of text, how is it saved, how do you retrieve it, whether you find that to be user-friendly or not, I think is pretty individual probably. But something that's certainly, that is what you're predominantly using these for, is to be able to go into those different kinds of files and code them. And so you want to be okay with whatever that looks like. Again, what kind of data files are you using, or what kind of data? Because some of the files might not be supported by all. And if you were doing a lot of internet research and looking at that, I would suspect that you'd want to do sort of a deep dive into comparing all of these. And it's interesting, but most of them will support some level of survey data. So you will actually be able to sort of incorporate survey data in these files, like upload it. You can't necessarily do a lot with it. Although MAXQDA actually says it has analysis functionality for quantitative data. I don't know what that looks like, but I think all of them are trying to support sort of mixed methods projects. So if that was something you were really looking for, that might be an interesting software. All of them seem to have different kinds of reporting, although in the end, the basis of it would have to be the same in terms of reporting your codes. But you want to be able to have that be flexible and to meet your needs. Most of them allow you to choose what's in the report. But again, you might want to dig into that if you wanted it to look a particular way. Also, and in relation to that, a lot of them offer a lot of different kind of visualizations of your data. And so maybe you want to be able to create certain kind of visuals. That's not particularly my forte, so I'm not sure. But it does look as though some of them have a little bit more on that front than others. Word clouds are ubiquitous in these softwares, but MAXQDA and Nvivo have the capacity for users to build mind maps. So it doesn't create them from your data, but it will allow you to build different sort of mind maps of your project, maybe your analysis. And then some of them also have, will show it sort of graphically as well, which could be of interest. And so this is just an example of Nvivo for those of you that haven't used it. Again, this is fake data, which just sort of gives you an idea of pretty complicated. So all of these software, I would say there's a learning curve to it. They are all good in that if you have an extensive amount of data, they're pretty convenient. And because they, as you can see, sort of like under data on the left-hand side with your files, so that can include all kinds of different kinds of files. And therefore, you essentially can have this be a holder of all of the different kinds of information that you want to use within a project. And that can include literature as well. So organizationally, these are really quite helpful, particularly for really big projects. Or I've found it to be the case. And they have different ways of, so there's coding where you're looking at text, but also you can sort of classify some of your data. You can, there are complicated ways of sort of looking at the interconnections between pieces of it as well, all of which can be quite interesting, especially when you're looking at something more complicated. So the one thing I would say though is realistically, all of these have free trials, and it's worthwhile to take the time to download them and see which one you find the most user-friendly, I would say, because you're spending an awful lot of money, and you want it to be something that, works for you, certainly. And also their functionality in general is at a comparable level. So really, it's much more about the particulars of, say, what kind of data you're using or what kind of analysis you're doing, and maybe one fits better with that or personal preference. And I enjoy qualitative research. Thank you. So I'm going to try to stop sharing and take questions, if there are any.
Thanks, Natasha. This is Carrie. Great presentation. I don't really have a question. I just thought I would make a comment. It's it's a newer feature to me. It might be an old feature to everyone else, but I thought I would share it. Is one of the last Zoom meetings I was on, there's actually a transcription functionality where you can actually see it on the bottom of the screen, but then it also produces a text-based almost transcription. You have to speak very clearly. But knowing with COVID, we're using Zoom and those kinds of medias a lot more often. I wish I would have known that a few months ago, but
Right.
Anyway, I haven't had a chance to try it, and I don't know if it's something on maybe a paid Zoom subscription. But anyway, it's just, I thought I would mention that because it was just, last week that I noticed it and thought it was a really neat function, and it would definitely save as long as, again, I'm not sure how well it works in terms of picking up the nuances, but it would save probably still quite a bit of time if you're transcribing your own interviews.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's definitely a good point. Yeah.
And then from my perspective, I've used Atlas.ti in my master's thesis and Nvivo in my PhD. And honestly, but again, for my type of analysis, I actually didn't find between the two of them, like I picked it based on supervisor really, in terms of, my thesis supervisor used Atlas.ti, and I'm not sure if Shelley used Nvivo. I don't know how I ended up going that way. Maybe she did. I'm not sure. Maybe, I don't know. But I found in terms of functionality for what I needed, because I was doing just, really qualitative description in terms of the analysis. Both of them for that functionality worked really well. And to your point, they really help with organization and keeping things organized. But, if someone said I had to use one over the other, I found both of them were pretty user-friendly and very similar for what I needed them for. So.
Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah. It certainly seemed like they have a lot of the same functionality, certainly. But you make a good point in terms of often it's, what are other team members using too? You need to be able to sort of have those files the same in order to look at them. So.
And I just saw Shelley's comment. So it wasn't Shelley that made me pick Nvivo. She was using Microsoft Word. So
right.
I'm not really sure why I went with Nvivo. I don't know if it was because it was a program that UNB had. I think maybe that there was a reason why.
Yeah, I think you wanted to learn something new, actually, if I remember correctly. It was about 5 years ago, but I'm pretty sure it was that you wanted to learn something new and you had already used Atlas.
Okay, maybe that was it. But
Yeah.
either way, I find now that I have experience with both, they're very similar in terms of, I mean, I like them because when you're using working with a lot of data, it's great for, just organizing your thoughts and your codes and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I see Bryn with the Post-it notes and highlighters. I had forgotten to mention that, yeah, when I started doing qualitative research, absolutely it was just paper and highlighters and printouts of transcripts. So, I mean, that is absolutely, yeah, works as well. I do think once you get to a certain amount of data, to Carrie's point too, like the organization of it is what these help with, essentially. Yeah. And Linda is also with Bryn. Yep. I mean, that definitely works for sure. And then colored text as well, which is also, and I meant to say in the Word discussion of Word, that highlighting and text color is definitely something that is often used too. Sorry, did I cut somebody off?
Oh, no, I was just going to say it's Monique. If anybody else wants to ask their questions, feel free. Just you have to make sure that you unmute yourself. I'm noticing everybody is put into mute mode right now. Anything else, people? We have many tools in the toolkit that Natasha shared with us today, and it's great to hear everyone's experience on the line. Maybe there are some favorites that you wanted to talk about today, or maybe there are ones that you were thinking about exploring and you have more questions on the ones that were reviewed. So feel free to ask away.
So I think Bryn asked, is there a preference depending on theoretical position? I don't think so. I did mention that though, just because I do think that you might be using it in a different way, depending on sort of what type of analysis you're doing and across over what kind of, across different kinds of data as well. So yeah, but I don't know that it would necessarily mean that one was better than the other. Although I do think that that's not true, because in that example of the Excel file where that person was using sort of one code for one sentence, that's not a coding style that if you were doing sort of a thematic analysis, I wouldn't say that that's very useful necessarily, unless, the conversation was very simplistic. So yeah, but that seems kind of critical. But yeah, so I do think it could come into play in that way. If that answers things.
Does anybody else have a system that maybe wasn't talked about today that they found they had a good experience with?
I do see that Bryn said that that's what she was sort of trying to get at. And as you get into things like narrative analysis, is one tool better than another? I do think I think as you get sort of layered in your analysis, some of the more specialized software would be preferable, just because it's easier to keep track of. And
Natasha,
again, yeah.
sorry, I was going to say I concur. This is Carrie. Just
Okay, yeah.
I was going to say, from my perspective, it really depends on the amount of data. Again, this is just an N of one, but
Right.
the amount of data and the type of analysis you're doing.
Yeah.
You know, when you start to balance out, like, you know, potentially hundreds of codes, yeah, like to your point, if you're getting into different layers of analysis, the software in my mind is so much easier just to keep track of things. And to your point earlier about how you can create some visuals,
Yeah.
which is also helpful, again, when you're getting into some really deep, thick analysis where you have lots of codes floating around and you're trying to kind of, you know, bucket them. You know, but again, I think you can still do that with, you know, a pair of scissors and paper, you know, and highlighters and, you know, or a whiteboard or what have you. It's just, it's a tool that I think in terms of organization might help, but I don't think if someone used a more simplistic method that the analysis per se, because I think the analysis happens kind of, it's the researcher themselves that, you know, really does. And it's just, these are tools to help with that. So I don't think it would make one analysis better than the other, but definitely for organizing and keeping track of so much data, it's easier to find because, you know, with a click of a mouse, you can go back and say, oh, okay, here are these codes and look at them and, you know, pull them up, and they're just so simple and clean and easy to organize.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, those are all good points, Carrie, definitely. And you can reorganize them easily too, which is really great, right? Like you could put them into different kinds of folders and thoughts and, you know, have memos about them and all that kind of stuff.
And then also a little plug for next month is that, you know, when you are coding, especially early on, you know, you could have a bunch of different codes that eventually, after maybe a few transcripts, you realize, well, no, these are all kind of the same. And it allows you to kind of go back and then mix and merge. And you're not having to go back and change your highlighter color. So,
exactly.
you know, so there's some value in it, but again, I think it's the amount of data that you have to do. And then to your point, it is quite pricey. As a student, I think I paid like maybe a few $100s for an Nvivo, but again, it was like a limited time. So I guess the positive to that is then you're pressed to make sure that you get all your analysis done in a short period of time.
Yeah, that's right. You need to get those reports out. Like, yeah. Definitely. So Sarah has a question. She's mostly used to quantitative analysis, although there's some strategies to mitigate bias in qualitative analysis with these. Oh, are there some strategies to mitigate bias in qualitative analysis with these programs? So yeah, I mean, I think they've tried to sort of build in some things. I haven't actually used a lot of this functionality, but I know that it's there. So some of them, like the specialized softwares, you can do a comparison between coders. So essentially what it'll do is it would look at, say, what I coded and then what Carrie coded, and it would tell you how much that matches up. Now, I will say that I'm not a huge fan of that, because essentially what should be happening is a reflexive, if you're using a team approach where there's more than one person coding, you should be talking about how you're coding. And also you would get people to look over sort of what it is you've already coded, and to ensure that you're doing it sort of in the same way. And if you have disagreements about that, or you're rethinking some of your codes, then you have conversations. So while some of them have sort of built in an automated way to compare coding between two people, in which case what would happen is you each would code something and then it looks at it, right? Like, and you'd merge your file, essentially, I think. Well, it depends on the software, but regardless, it's comparing them. And that could be helpful for your conversation, I guess. But in the end, it's not going to resolve that. And I don't know that that's necessarily what I would call bias either. I mean, that's just inter-rater reliability, I guess. But again, you're using sort of quantitative terms within qualitative research, which I'm not a huge fan of. I don't know whether that's really answering your question, Sarah, so much as saying I'm not sure that, yeah, I'm not sure I would use that kind of language, because I think realistically, yeah, there are other ways that's not built into the software that qualitative research has checks and balances against, sort of to mitigate bias. Okay, great. She says she understands, which is awesome because I rambled on there a bit. Oh, Stephanie, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I guess it's more for everyone to give their 2 cents. There's a new digital research infrastructure organization that is just put out a call for white papers, and I'm working on it as a part of my project. One of the things I'm thinking of, we've kind of nibbled around it and talking about the different ways that we integrate, that Carrie had mentioned, with using like real-time transcription as a part of software like Zoom. If the idea could be conceived of to have a house for these types of things, so that when we're actually gathering people online to conduct interviews, that rather than using the existing data management software systems of then sending it to the cloud and transcribing, that real-time transcription then is used for accessibility for, you know, a variety of different reasons of why that would be important to have in real time, and then is then something that connects to a data management software, and then is also then housed somewhere safe and secure that would be comprehensive, so that it would avoid running into some of those REB issues of how they're stored in various different ways and places. So I guess basically that's the idea that I'm going to be suggesting. And given this is what we're talking about, and they're all a bunch of humans who are likewise interested, I thought, does that seem of interest? Does that seem to pose more problems? What are some thoughts about that?
Right. I'll just give some thoughts, but I mean, anybody can jump in there. That sounds really interesting. Again, like, especially coming from like the health authority, our problem is mainly sort of where these companies house their data, and being able to sort of like explicate how it's secure, so that, you know, our privacy officer is okay with that, particularly as it would be health related information. You know, but as you say, if that was all sort of, you know, done appropriately, that would certainly be of interest. I think the automated transcription that I've run into, I mean, it's definitely getting better, but it's not perfect. So there's that, I guess. But if it was storing audio files with that so that you could double check, you know, that'd be pretty cool. As you say, I mean, so much of what we do now has to be sort of done remotely, particularly for research. So it would certainly be helpful. Anybody else?